guys, welcome back to my lecture series, DBT for Students. So today we're going to continue with interpersonal effectiveness, but for those of you who are just joining, my name is Annie and I'm a student at George Washington University, and I've been studying DBT therapy and psychology for a few years now, and it occurred to me at some point that the skills in DBT are really applicable in everyday life, especially I think for students and high school students and college students kind of trying to navigate things. So these are kind of a bunch of helpful life hacks that I think make everything like a bit more effective, which is the goal. So quick recap of what DBT is. Stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy, but we're using it more as pro tips. There are 4 units in traditional DBT: mindfulness, interpersonal effectiveness, emotion regulation, and distress tolerance. So for mindfulness, I usually start each video, which I'll do after this recap, with the mindfulness skill and then move into the unit. So right now we're on interpersonal effectiveness and we're going into our last skill, which is kind of exciting. So we'll get into that, but first let's do the mindfulness activity. So this is something that I think most people are going to be kind of familiar with in concept, but it's done a little bit differently in DBT, and I think it's just a little more clarity into the whole situation and looking at it effectively. So this is a pros and cons list, sort of like a pros and cons list on steroids, and it's mindful in the sense that it helps you just lay everything out and kind of see what you want to do, but it's mostly the gathering the information and like seeing all of the different angles. That's the mindfulness part of it. And DBT mindfulness is usually not as passive as I think people often think it is. There's not as much meditation. Most of it's pretty guided and more based on like observation. So the skill is a DBT pros and cons list. So I think it's easier just to give you an example and show you how to do it. So the example I used was just using the pro cons of using DBT skills. So a DBT pros and cons list is like a little bit different than your typical pro and cons list. It can be a little confusing, but I think it's definitely worth sorting out. So like you'd expect on the side, there are pros and cons. And then I think the main difference is that on the top, you're going to write the behavior or action that you're having question, and then basically just the opposite of that. So, you know, I have using skills and then not using skills. So in the first box, it's going to be the pro of using skills, then it's the pros of not using skills, the cons of using skills, and the cons of not using skills. And it seems a little redundant, but I think you'll find if you try it out, it's actually, there are differences between the 4 that are kind of substantial. So again, I just did this for using skills, so I'll run through it. Obviously, it's not comprehensive, just an example. But I thought about the pros of using skills. Okay, well, it might make things more effective. You might have more self-respect in the end because you've made maybe a more thought-out decision or a less emotional decision, more based on like a balance of reason and emotion. And then I have, it might cause less drama because instead of acting impulsively and leaving a mess to sort out, you are kind of waiting and mitigating that room for mess. So the pros of not using a skill is that usually emotional or in the moment reactions will give you like a sense of instant gratification. Like if someone cuts you off when you're driving and you like honk your horn and kind of yell, that's releasing an immediate thing. So that's one of the, I guess, perks of not using a skill. So that's a pro. And then the other thing is it's way less work to not act skillfully. So, I mean, I think it makes more work in the long run, but less work in the short run. So then a con of using skills, which is a little bit different, is that it's a lot of work. It's kind of the opposite there. The hard part, I think, with DBT that I find just kind of in general in life is that no matter how effective you are, you only have control over yourself. So you can't control the other person, and that means that you can be the most effective human in the world and still just be totally shut down if someone else is unwilling to be skillful. So that's one of the cons I have for using DBT skills. And then the no immediate gratification. So in the con for not using DBT skills, I think is part of it, like you can lose your composure, you can come off in a way you don't mean to. Oftentimes when we're upset, we're not necessarily putting our best foot forward, which can lead to maybe regretting the situation or some embarrassment later. It can definitely harm relationships if you don't handle situations that well, especially with interpersonal effectiveness. And then it can leave kind of a hole that you have to dig yourself out of. So that's the DBT pro and con list. Again, I know it seems a little redundant, but I highly recommend trying it. I definitely use it for everything. Okay, now to jump into interpersonal effectiveness. So this is the unit we've been working on the last few videos, and we're going to keep going with that and look at the last skill today. So a quick recap. We established there are sort of three main goals in encounters with other people. So one of them is getting what you want. So that's when the priority of the exchange is your desired outcome. So we talked about that in terms of like getting an extension on a paper or a goal-related outcome. And that's when we use the Dear Man skill, which we talked about previously. So the second one is making and keeping friends, which we talked about in terms of how to relate to people and social signal even when they might not be your favorite person, especially when it's just like a mixer or something you sort of have to have a working relationship to maintain. And that's, again, using the give skill. And so today we're on the third priority, which is self-respect. And that's going to be the fast skill. But I want to modify the self-respect a little bit to make it, I think, more applicable and kind of straightforward. I think we're going to talk about it in terms of how to decline or say no to a request. I think especially in school and, you know, kind of in all facets of life, there's a lot of pressure to feel like you have to do everything or show people that you can do everything. And sometimes that manifests in taking on maybe more challenges or projects from other people than is actually healthy or that you should be handling. So we're going to talk about a way to decline those offers that makes you still feel all right with yourself and not guilty about it. So again, that's going to be the fast skill. And we'll run through an example with the specific breakdown steps in a second. But to go through it as a quick overview, the F stands for fair. And that's sort of, I think, twofold. The first part is mindfully assessing the situation to see if the person is, you know, right to make that request, to see if the request itself is fair, if it's framed in a way where you feel like you do have an option, not just like where you feel backed into a corner. And then also something to think about with the fairness is just being fair to both of you and the other person's like sides, which involves a lot of validating both yourself and the other person. Because again, one of the big principles in DBT is that two things can be right and neither of them are necessarily better than the other. They can coexist. It's a matter of figuring out what's most effective for yourself. So that's the F. The A stands for no apologies, which again, we're going to get into a little more in a bit, but I think this one's really important because I think people don't think about it often, but over-apologizing can actually invalidate the other person and I think lead to less clear boundaries and perhaps more complications in the future. So the S stands to stick to your own values, which is pretty self-explanatory, but it's sort of like broken record repeating yourself and making sure that you're being clear as to why you're turning down the request. And again, I think that's sort of like the establishing boundaries, which leaks into the being truthful aspect of it, which I think will become more clear when we run through the example. But it's just being honest with the other person about, you know, what, in the case of saying no, like what you can handle, what they're asking of you, the consequences might be on you, and just really trying to be honest with yourself and with the other person. So for this skill, I'm going to use a situation where, let's say it's like 10 o'clock at night and you still have some homework left to do, and a friend texts you and asks if you can help her with her essay. And so we're going to talk about how to say no to something like that. Again, it's applicable for any situation, this one's just, I think, kind of common and an easy example. So the first thing we're going to do is check to see if it's fair. So again, there's a couple points in this. So the things that I came up to assess if it's fair or not is the first is like, what's the toll it would take on me? So again, this is really being mindful and thinking, is this a fair thing to ask of me? Is this something that'll be difficult or harmful or completely out of the question? So with the case of helping a friend with her homework, assuming that we have a pretty good friendship, it's definitely fair of her to ask because we have a relationship. Helping her with homework isn't breaking any of my personal values, and I think it's something that's, again, things can be fair to ask and you can also decline them. That's not mutually exclusive. So the other question is, what could the possible toll on me be? So like, what would result if I did go through with this? So in this case, we're going to say that if I did help my friend with her homework, I would end up staying up too late and only getting a little sleep and could potentially feel pretty bad the next day and might not get my own work done. Maybe I have a test or something I need to be kind of awake for. So it's just kind of the ramifications of not sleeping. The second thing for the is it fair that I add is what's the severity of the request and what are the possible outcomes? So as nice as it would be to kind of get to feel like we can decline things all of the time, which you always have a right to do, but there are sometimes when the consequences of doing that outweigh the toll it would take on you. So maybe if it was actually, a midterm paper and if my friend didn't do well on it, she wasn't going to graduate, then losing the sleep might be secondary to helping my friend graduate, depending on kind of your values in the situation. So I think definitely assessing whether or not the situation is kind of life or death or if it's something that has a lot of flexibility is important. And then the third thing I added was asking yourself if the relationship is balanced. So is this the kind of person who does favors for you often or has helped you out when you needed it? Or is this the kind of person who's constantly coming to you for help and doesn't seem to reciprocate it? Because that might also affect the fairness of the situation. So once you've done that, in this case, we're going to say that it's a fair request to ask. The toll on me would be that I'm going to lose sleep and perhaps perform more poorly on my own. The stakes are pretty low for this friend. It's just a normal assignment, so there's not a big outcome that's super negative if she doesn't turn it in on time. It's not threatening anyone's future. And we'll say that this friend has also helped me out in the past, but we have a pretty decent relationship and are respectful of each other's boundaries. So then, in declining, we're on the don't over apologize. I think a lot of people do this because they think it's helpful or in some way validating the other person, when I think, ironically, it can really do the opposite. So part of the issue is if someone's asking you for a request and you decline and then just kind of repeatedly, say I'm so sorry, like I'm so sorry, I'm really sorry, you can do, I think, two things that are invalidating. The first is it's not really giving a reason for why you're not doing it. So it can kind of leave the other person wondering, well, if you're so sorry, like why say no? What's the actual issue? And that just leads to room for confusion and possible harm in the relationship. And I think the other thing about over apologizing is it kind of turns a situation into an emotional thing about you. So if you seem pretty upset that you can't do the request, the person might not feel comfortable asking in the future because they're worried you're going to be too upset when you have to decline. So that's sort of like an emotional fragility that can be avoided, I think, by not over apologizing and being confident in your answer, because it sort of communicates to the other person that you have enough boundaries in place that you're happy to decline things and then perhaps do them again in the future and can be asked for different tasks. And the other thing is I think that over apologizing is a way to avoid taking responsibility for your decision, which isn't helpful in congruency because, for example, the reason I would say no to the friend homework question is because I think that I need like 7 hours of sleep a night to function. And so if I were to just apologize a ton, it's not really taking ownership of why. And it's not helpful information for my friend to know when it might be appropriate or inappropriate to ask in the future. So sticking to your values is the next S in the FAST. So again, I think this is kind of a matter of boundaries and consistency and being truthful, which we'll get to. But again, it seems sort of easier to just apologize a bunch or come up with an excuse for why you're going to say no. But I think in reality, I know I personally would rather someone just tell me, what they thought and why they couldn't do the request, rather than just kind of feel bad and apologize, and then I feel awkward for asking, and then it turns into a whole thing. So I think if you're really clear with your values and you're consistent about that, people will understand that you have certain boundaries in the future, and it won't become an ongoing problem. And I think this is like a really key point, especially in sort of the dating scene. I know it's tempting if you're asked out and you don't want to go out with someone to apologize a bunch and say you're busy or, you have something else to do, so busy. But the problem with that is it's not expressing a value, and it's also something that could keep kind of going on. So it's like, oh no, I'm busy tonight, leaves room for the person to ask you again, which isn't really fair for them because it's kind of like leading them on and they're unclear as to what your true thoughts are, but it's, also kind of a pain for you. So I think it's really important to establish, no, I'm not that interested in you. Like a firm boundary that people know in the future so that you might not be requested to do those things all the time. Or if it's like the homework, maybe a boundary that's more flexible, like, I don't like to help people with homework after a certain time because I really value my sleep. If it's not an emergency situation, then I think that you're on your own for this, but I'm happy to help you in the future if you get to me sooner. Something like that. And so the being truthful thing, I kind of frame it as the question between can't or won't, which again goes back to the boundaries and consistency. So there's a big, it's really tempting to kind of take some of the responsibility of saying no to people away. I think as a culture, we sort of think that somehow that's a bad thing, like not being able to help everyone all the time, when in reality, sometimes it's healthier for you and the other person. But I think the kind of knee-jerk reaction is to come up with an excuse and apologize a ton. Oh, I'm so sorry I can't tonight. So the reality isn't that I can't. The reality is that I don't want to, or I won't. And being clear about that, again, is how you sort of end the situation without anyone getting confused or hurt or having it drag on. And it also lays out kind of a future game plan. And you also, I think, if you're just honest about what you will and won't do, people are more comfortable asking you for favors. I think the thought is that if you say no, they won't think they can come to you. But I think if you say no and you're honest about why you're saying no or your values behind it, then it just shows that you're someone who can handle an emotional situation without making it about you or dramatic, or without, I think, most importantly, without making the other person feel bad for having asked. Because it's, it's not personal. Or it could be personal, I guess, but it's a value of yours and it's just the truth. So in that situation, with the friend doing homework, to run that past in real time, I think, it would look something like the person texts you, can you help me with my homework? It's due tomorrow. I'm really behind on it, for whatever reason. I think a response using the FAST to say no would be something like, wow, that sounds really hard. I know classes have been pretty tough this year, and it seems like you have a lot of homework, and I'm really sorry you're feeling overwhelmed. But I actually really value my sleep, and if it's not an emergency situation, I think I'm going to decline and have to pass on that. In the future, if you need help, I'm available, but I just prefer you reach out to me before it got too late so that I could schedule my evening accordingly. And, that way I can get my 7 hours of sleep, which I really need, and I can help you with your work. But today, I just don't feel as though it would be beneficial for me or healthy for me to take that on. So I know that might feel slightly awkward to prioritize yourself. I think, again, we're pretty ingrained not to do that. But it's kind of that thing where you can't help other people until you help yourself. And this is obviously a smaller version of that, but I think it's the same idea where it's you need to be able to say no and learn how to prioritize yourself and your values if you want to be able to help people in the future and still, be a healthy, functioning individual and not overwhelmed all the time. So that's our last interpersonal effectiveness skill. Before we move on, I just kind of want to do a quick troubleshooting session, because I think they're, these are skills that you're not going to master right away. I still practice them constantly. They also aren't always going to be effective. Again, you can't really control the other person. So some things just to think about, I think, in every interpersonal interaction you have with someone, especially if you're asking for something or they're asking for something, are the following. So I think that the first thing to look for is capability. And that can be literal or emotional. Some people, for example, are really good at handling venting, and you can vent to them and they just listen and they reaffirm you. Some people are problem solvers, and that's just sort of who they are. So they might not have the capability to listen to you the way you want to be listened to, which you have to think about going in. Obviously, your priorities, which we talked about, the main three, are important. Whether or not there's kind of an equal playing field for rights, if they have a right to ask something of you, if you have a right to ask something of them, sort of if what you're doing is okay, I guess. The self-respect, again, is just being clear, I think, is the most key thing in interpersonal encounters. And I think that even though it seems kind of uncomfortable and maybe counter to what we're taught to do a lot of the time, I think being clear and firm actually makes you a more valuable friend, and in the long run helps relationships. Then there's the question of authority, which is really important in school, because there are times when your goals or maybe how you approach the situation is going to be affected by the position of authority, like a teacher or someone who has some sort of charge over you. This is going to, I think, alter a little bit some of the fact-checking and also some of the fairness questions. And sometimes there's protocol with authority that you have to take into account when you're making requests. And then there's, the relationship. And again, I think this is also part of give and take, where it's assessing, is this relationship important to me? Is this a casual relationship? Do I just need to make it work for the time being? How much should I invest in it? But just being pretty clear with yourself going in about where the person kind of stands with you. The long-term goals versus short-term goals is really important, because let's take the sleep, for example, again. Short-term, if I just wanted to quote-unquote be a good friend or make my friend happy, I might say yes, and I might feel good about myself for 2 hours. But the next morning, I'm probably going to feel crappy. If I fail that test, I'm in trouble. If I don't get my homework done, that's a long-term thing for me. If I keep losing sleep, that could affect you. So obviously that's a simple example, but I think it's really important to take those into account when you're trying to figure out how to handle an interpersonal situation. And then the give and take is sort of what I just described in the first one. And then the last two are a matter of kind of fact-checking. So how well do you know the facts? A lot of that is just reassessing the situation. I think, again, we're kind of conditioned with other people to distort the facts a little bit. I think it's really important to sit back and think about, is this really a big deal? Like, is this really something that needs to be done right now? Is this something that will actually affect the relationship? I think there's a tendency to think, like, if I don't do this, this person's going to hate me. Or if I turn this guy down, everyone's going to hate me. No one's going to ask me out again. Like, myths like that might get in the way. And then there's the question of timing. So in our pros or cons list, we talked about how often not using skills can have instant gratification, whereas using skills might be delayed. And that's kind of goes along with the timing thing and also the other person's capabilities. So say you want to request something from your mom, maybe you want to like use the car or whatever, and if your mom's having a really bad day and just stressed out and clearly not in a good mood, it might not be a very reasonable time to talk to her about it, even if you want an answer right then. You might have to use some patience and kind of wait it out a little. So taking into account the other person and where they're at is also really important. Okay, so those are some of the things to think about before using skills or just in any interpersonal situation. And again, I think that the frustrating part is, while you can be super effective, sometimes other people aren't. And that's just a deficit of skills and not something that either of you, are at fault for, but something that is frustrating when you've put a lot of work into handling a situation. But before just assessing that the other person's not capable, I have kind of a few tips to see if you're doing everything you can to make this effective. So these are just some troubleshooting questions. So if the first time maybe you use, a dear man, a give, or a fast, or any other sort of mindful skills to go into interpersonal encounters and it doesn't work, these are just, I think, 5 good questions to ask yourself, and then to decide whether or not you want to kind of try again or alter your approach or what went wrong in this situation or what was ineffective. So the first is, are you being clear about what you want? I think that we have a tendency to think that people can mind read more than they can. So, for example, if that friend had just sort of been like, yeah, no, I have like a ton of homework. I'm really stressed out about it. Like, really use some help with it, but I mean, it's fine. Like, I'll figure it out. I'm just stressed. It's like, in her mind, she might be very clearly asking for help. But if you're not picking up on those nuances, it can lead to a lot of confusion and also resentment if the other person feels like they've asked for something and it's not being acknowledged. And the same goes in reverse. So I think that even though, again, it might feel kind of uncomfortable to ask for help in like a vulnerable way, because we're sort of taught that's, a bad thing, like you shouldn't need help. That's kind of a myth that gets in the way. But I think that realistically, this just prevents a lot of potential fights with friends and a lot of resentment is avoided. We just talked about the impatience, but that's sort of, again, a big one sometimes for me. I know I usually want to know the answer right away, or if I have an idea or a thought, I'm pretty impatient. So sitting with my own desire to have something done and thinking about if the other person is at a point where they're ready to take that on or think about it is pretty key. The third one is, are your emotions too intense? So sometimes we're ineffective just because, again, we're human and we have these strong emotions. But before using an interpersonal skill, sometimes it's necessary to use some distress tolerance or emotion regulation, which we'll talk about in a second, in the next chapter. So, because if your emotions are too intense, oftentimes, even if you're sort of trying to hide it, other people pick up on it. Social signaling is really powerful. So even if you're trying to affect something else, most people can tell within 7 milliseconds if your threat system's activated, if your safety system's activated, and how you're responding. So sometimes the best thing to do is take a minute or however long you need, run through a couple of distress tolerance skills, which I will teach you later, and then come back to the situation. One of the fourth, and I think one of the bigger things, especially in the FAST skill, if you're asking for help or declining help in a way that you want to maintain your self-respect, is are there worries or assumptions that are getting in the way of the skill working or of the way you're approaching it? So again, that's kind of the thought of like, oh, if I say no, she'll never talk to me again. That would be a misassumption. Or, well, if I say I can't help someone, then I'm weak. And if I'm weak, then I'm, pathetic and I'll never be able to do anything. That's another kind of assumption and a myth perpetrated, I would say, by, society with the you have to be strong and do everything by yourself sort of thing, or take on challenges. So obviously that stuff is all valuable, but it's not always the most effective in the situation. So I think really sitting back when you're thinking about fact checking and trying to figure out, is this something I'm assuming the other person would do, or is this something that is based in fact? And then finally, and this is sort of frustrating for me, you run into it at some point with all the skills, but it's asking yourself if the environment is just too powerful. So again, there are times when you can be incredibly skillful and just totally nail these skills and be really effective as a person, and the environment still might override you. And that's probably a time where you just have to radically accept things the way they are, which we sort of talked about in the introduction. But the theory is that if you keep ruminating on it and it can't change, that's sort of where the distress comes into play. And if you can, once you've, given it a good try and you've done due diligence on it and it's still not going to work out for you, if you can try to accept that just as it is, that's going to mitigate distress, because the reality is you can't change it. It's not going to change, or, if it does, it's not going to be immediate. And you might as well accept it because it's not going anywhere, is sort of the idea. And to continually be upset about it is just going to perpetuate distress. Okay, so that's it for interpersonal effectiveness, and that's one of it's sort of a module for change. Next time, we're going to start talking about distress tolerance, which is more to do with acceptance and about how to make the best out of a situation when you might be too emotional or upset, whatever, to effectively use skills yet that are change-based. So it's, if you get into a fight with a friend and you want to propose some sort of reconciliation, we're going to talk about skills to get your emotions down to a level to where you can do that and have it be effective. So thanks for watching, and please tune in next time.